Most people think the Epstein story is about a predator and his famous friends. They're wrong. The Epstein story is about money. Specifically, it's about how the global financial system, the same system that manages your pension, your mortgage, your economy, created a machine that allowed one man to become untouchable. On January 30th, 2026, the United States Department of Justice released over 3 million pages of documents, 180,000 images, 2,000 videos, the largest single document release in the history of the American justice system. 500 attorneys spent weeks reviewing them. The files span 5 major investigations, from Palm Beach, Florida to the Southern District of New York. From FBI field offices to the Office of Inspector General. And buried inside those 3.5 million pages is a story that nobody is telling you. Not the news networks, not the conspiracy channels, not the politicians who demanded these files be released. It's the story of how a college dropout from Brooklyn, a man who never earned a degree, never passed a Series 7 exam, never managed a publicly audited fund, somehow accumulated over $600 million in assets. It's the story of how JPMorgan Chase, Deutsche Bank, Bear Stearns, and over 20 other financial institutions kept doing business with a convicted sex offender. It's the story of how zero interest rate policy created a playground for the ultra-wealthy to operate above the law. And it's the story of how the same regulatory failures that allowed the 2008 financial crisis allowed Jeffrey Epstein, for the next 2 hours, we're going to follow the money. Because in economics, money always tells the truth, even when people lie. This is Stonks Forum, and this is the most important economic story of the decade. If you care about how the financial system actually works, how the ultra-wealthy operate in a completely different economy than the rest of us, then buckle in. Because what I'm about to show you will fundamentally change how you think about money, power, and accountability. If you're new here, this channel breaks down the economics that shape your world. Hit subscribe, turn on notifications, because this is just the beginning. We're going deep on this one. Here's a question that should keep every economist up at night. How does a man with no college degree, no formal training in finance, no track record, and no audited returns become a billionaire-tier money manager? The answer reveals everything wrong with our financial system. Jeffrey Edward Epstein was born on January 20th, 1953, in Brooklyn, New York. The grandson of Jewish immigrants, he grew up in a modest neighborhood, a far cry from the private islands and $77 million Manhattan townhouses he would later inhabit. He was, by all accounts, exceptionally bright, particularly in mathematics. He graduated from high school early, briefly attended Cooper Union and New York University, but never completed a degree from either institution. Now, let's pause here, because in the world of finance, credentials matter, or at least they're supposed to. To manage money for wealthy clients, you typically need a Series 7 license, a Series 66, CFA certification, or at minimum a degree from a reputable institution. Epstein had none of these, zero, and yet, within 15 years, he would be managing the fortune of one of America's wealthiest men. How? The answer begins at the Dalton School, one of Manhattan's most elite private institutions. In 1974, Epstein was hired to teach calculus and physics, despite not having a college degree. The man who hired him was Donald Barr, the school's headmaster and father of future Attorney General William Barr. This is not a conspiracy theory. It's documented history. Epstein was hired based on charm, mathematical ability, and the recommendation of connections, No formal verification of his credentials was ever conducted. At Dalton, Epstein didn't just teach mathematics, he networked. Among the parents of his students were some of New York's wealthiest families: investment bankers, corporate executives, old money aristocrats. Epstein learned something at Dalton that would define his entire career. In the world of the ultra-wealthy, access is the most valuable currency. Not knowledge, not skill, access. In 1976, Epstein was dismissed from Dalton. The circumstances remain murky, but a parent connection led him to Bear Stearns, one of Wall Street's most prestigious investment banks. And here's where the story gets economically fascinating. At Bear Stearns, Epstein didn't rise through the conventional ranks. He didn't become an analyst, then an associate, then a vice president. Instead, he carved out a unique niche, serving as a personal advisor to ultra-high net worth clients who valued one thing above all else: discretion. He became what the industry would later call a concierge banker, someone who handled the private financial affairs of people too wealthy and too important to use normal channels. Now, this is a critical economic concept. There are two financial systems operating in parallel. There's the financial system you and I use, regulated, transparent, subject to reporting requirements, capital gains taxes, and FDIC oversight. And then there's the shadow financial system used by the ultra-wealthy, offshore trusts, shell companies, private placements, estate planning vehicles, and relationship-based advisory services that operate with minimal regulatory oversight. Epstein didn't just participate in the shadow system, he became one of its architects. At Bear Stearns, Epstein also learned something else that would prove essential: the power of leverage. Not financial leverage, but human leverage. According to multiple accounts, including the newly released DOJ files, Epstein cultivated relationships by providing his superiors and colleagues with access to social events, introductions, and, according to some accounts, more compromising arrangements. He learned that in the world of high finance, the person who controls access to pleasure controls the relationship. Think about that from an economic perspective. Most people think of corruption in finance as being about money, bribes, kickbacks, insider trading. Epstein understood something more fundamental. The real currency of the ultra-wealthy isn't money, it's influence. And influence is best purchased through things that money can't publicly buy. After leaving Bear Stearns in the early 1980s, Epstein founded his own firm, first as Intercontinental Assets Group, then rebranded as J. Epstein & Company. And here's where he made the most audacious claim in the history of private wealth management. He announced that his firm would only accept clients with a net worth of $1 billion or more. Think about the economics of that claim. In the 1980s, there were only a few hundred billionaires on the planet. Epstein was essentially saying, "I'm so exclusive that only the richest people on Earth qualify for my services." It was a brilliant marketing strategy, one borrowed from luxury goods companies. By restricting access, he increased perceived value. It's the same principle behind Hermes making you wait for a Birkin bag. Scarcity creates demand. But here's the thing that every financial journalist has struggled with for decades. There's almost no evidence that Epstein had multiple billionaire clients. His entire fortune appears to have been built on the back of one single relationship. And that relationship was with Leslie Wexner. Leslie Wexner was the founder and CEO of Limited Brands, the parent company of Victoria's Secret, Bath & Body Works, and several other major retail chains. By the late 1980s, he was one of the wealthiest men in America, with a net worth exceeding $4 billion. In approximately 1987, Wexner hired Epstein as his personal money manager. Now, what happened next is one of the most extraordinary transfers of financial control in modern American business history. Wexner didn't just hire Epstein as an advisor. He granted him power of attorney, the legal authority to sign documents, make financial decisions, buy and sell assets, and conduct business on Wexner's behalf. This is almost unheard of in the world of professional wealth management. Even the most trusted financial advisors typically operate under strict legal guardrails, fiduciary duties, compliance oversight, independent auditing. Epstein had virtually none of these constraints. Under this arrangement, Epstein managed an estimated $200 million of Wexner's money, but the financial flows went far beyond management fees. According to reporting by Forbes, the Deutsche LLP investigation, and the Senate Finance Committee, Wexner paid Epstein roughly $200 million over the course of their relationship. To put that in perspective, the typical wealth management fee is 1 to 2% of assets under management per year. If Epstein was managing $1 billion, which there's no evidence he was, a 2% fee would generate $20 million per year. The payments from Wexner vastly exceeded any reasonable fee structure. But it gets more bizarre. In 1989, Epstein somehow acquired Wexner's Manhattan townhouse at 9 East 71 Street, a 40-room, 21,000 square foot mansion valued at approximately $70.7 million for what appears to have been a transfer price of $0. The property was simply moved into an entity controlled by Epstein. Wexner has since claimed he was unaware of the full extent of Epstein's financial maneuvers and has said that Epstein misappropriated his funds. But the question remains, how does one of America's most sophisticated businessmen allow a single advisor to exercise this level of unchecked control? And here's the economics lesson buried in this relationship. The ultra-wealthy operate in a world where trust replaces regulation. When you're a billionaire, you don't submit to the same compliance frameworks as everyone else. You hire people you trust, grant them extraordinary power, and operate on handshake agreements that would never survive scrutiny in any regulated financial institution. Epstein exploited this cultural norm to extract massive wealth from a single patron and then used that wealth to build a network that made him untouchable. But Wexner wasn't the only source. Leon Black, the founder of Apollo Global Management, paid Epstein a staggering $158 million between 2012 and 2017 for so-called tax and estate planning services. Epstein had no formal training in tax law or accounting, yet Black paid him well above typical market rates, including at least $100 million in ad hoc payments with no written contracts or invoices. Senate investigators suggested that Epstein's true value to Black may have been something other than legitimate advice. We're about to get into the most insane part of this story: how Epstein plugged into Wall Street's biggest banks and hedge funds. But first, if you're finding this deep dive valuable, do me a favor, hit the like button. It tells YouTube's algorithm that this content matters, and it helps more people see the truth about how our financial system actually works. Now let's continue. Now we enter the part of the story that should terrify anyone who believes in financial regulation. Because what the DOJ files reveal, when you combine them with congressional investigations, bank settlements, and investigative journalism, is that Jeffrey Epstein maintained active financial relationships with over 20 banks and financial institutions. Not before his 2008 conviction. After it, a convicted sex offender, registered on the sex offender registry, continued to move hundreds of millions of dollars through the global financial system with minimal friction. Let's walk through the major institutions. First, Bear Stearns, Epstein's original Wall Street home. In August 2006, 1 month after federal investigators began probing his abuse of minors, Epstein invested $57 million in the Bear Stearns High-Grade Structured Credit Strategies Enhanced Leverage Fund. Yes, that is the same fund whose collapse in 2007 would help trigger the global financial crisis. Epstein was also chairman of Liquid Funding Limited, a Bermuda-based investment vehicle partially owned by Bear Stearns, loaded with the same mortgage-backed securities and collateralized loan obligations that would become synonymous with the worst financial excesses of the era. Now, here's a detail from the DOJ files that is absolutely staggering in its implications. According to the newly released documents and prior reporting, Epstein provided unspecified information to federal prosecutors in Florida as part of his 2008 plea negotiations. He was reportedly unnamed investor number 1 in the federal case against Bear Stearns fund managers Ralph Ciaffi and Matthew Tannen. In other words, Epstein leveraged his insider knowledge of Bear Stearns' fraudulent fund to negotiate a lighter sentence for his sex crimes. He traded financial intelligence for legal impunity. Former U.S. Attorney Alexander Acosta, who brokered Epstein's notoriously lenient 2008 plea deal, later told colleagues, according to reporting by the Daily Beast, that he had been told Epstein belonged to intelligence and to leave it alone. Whether this was CIA, Mossad, or some other entity has never been confirmed, but the financial implications are clear. Epstein operated in a space where normal rules did not apply. Second, JPMorgan Chase, America's largest bank by assets, maintained Epstein as a private banking client from 1998 until 2013, 5 full years after his conviction. During this period, Epstein processed hundreds of millions of dollars through JPMorgan accounts. In 2023, JPMorgan paid $290 million to settle a lawsuit brought by Epstein's victims, who alleged the bank knowingly facilitated his sex trafficking operation. The bank also paid $75 million to settle with the U.S. Virgin Islands government. Here's what's particularly damning from a financial compliance perspective. JPMorgan's own internal compliance systems flagged suspicious activity in Epstein's accounts, transactions that didn't match his stated business activities, large cash movements to individuals and entities with no clear business purpose, but these flags were overridden. Why? Because Epstein was generating fees. He was a profitable client. And in the world of private banking, profitable clients receive preferential treatment, even when compliance systems are screaming that something is wrong. Jess Staley, then the head of JPMorgan's private banking division, maintained a personal relationship with Epstein. The DOJ files include emails showing Staley and Epstein exchanging messages well into the 2010s. Staley would later become CEO of Barclays before resigning over his Epstein connections. Third, Deutsche Bank. When JPMorgan finally dropped Epstein in 2013, he simply moved to Deutsche Bank, which accepted him as a client despite his conviction and sex offender status. Deutsche Bank maintained the relationship until 2018. The bank was fined $150 million by New York regulators for compliance failures related to its Epstein account. In 2020, Deutsche Bank acknowledged its error of onboarding Epstein in 2013 and the weaknesses in our processes. But it wasn't just these 3 banks. Congressional investigators, led by Representative Janie Raskin, identified $1.5 billion in suspicious financial transactions flagged by banks tied to Epstein's alleged sex trafficking crimes. $1.5 billion. That's not a rounding error. That's a systemic failure of financial compliance on a massive scale. So here's the economic question nobody is asking. If the financial system's anti-money laundering protocols, the same protocols that freeze your account if you deposit $10,000 in cash, failed this catastrophically with Epstein, who else are they failing with right now? How many other Epsteins are operating within the system, protected by the same culture of profitable client impunity? Now we enter the part of this story that no other channel is covering. And it might be the most important part of all, because the Epstein files don't just reveal a predator's network. They reveal how financial elites understood and exploited the post-2008 monetary environment. And the person at the center of many of these conversations was Jeffrey Epstein. A recent analysis by the New Statesman, drawing on Epstein's newly released emails, reveals a fascinating window into how the ultra-wealthy viewed the era of zero interest rates and quantitative easing. In 2014, Epstein wrote to a Qatari business contact, "Zero interest rates provide once-in-a-lifetime opportunities. All fun." In 2015, he wrote to Peter Thiel, the billionaire PayPal co-founder and venture capitalist, "Zero interest rates are still churning out money." In 2016, he again corresponded with Thiel on the subject, describing zero interest rates as still too high. He discussed with Larry Summers, the former U.S. Treasury Secretary and president of Harvard, the idea of Peter Thiel running the U.S. economy. Although behind Thiel's back, Epstein considered him too autistic for the job. Now, let me explain why these emails are so significant from an economics perspective. After the 2008 financial crisis, central banks around the world, the Federal Reserve, the Bank of England, the European Central Bank, slashed interest rates to near zero and launched quantitative easing programs, flooding the financial system with trillions of dollars in new money. The stated goal was to stimulate economic recovery. But here's what actually happened. Near zero interest rates made traditional safe investments, government bonds, savings accounts, almost worthless. Money that would have sat in these safe harbors instead flooded into riskier assets: stocks, real estate, private equity, venture capital, hedge funds, and cryptocurrency. The result was an unprecedented inflation of asset prices. Stock markets reached all-time highs. Real estate prices in major cities became unreachable for average workers. And the people who already owned these assets, the ultra-wealthy, saw their net worth explode. Since 2008, the wealth of the world's billionaires, as a share of global GDP, has roughly doubled. This isn't a coincidence. It's a direct consequence of monetary policy. And Epstein and his circle weren't just benefiting from this policy, they were celebrating it, strategizing around it, and actively seeking to influence it. The Epstein emails show that he was in direct communication with some of the most influential economic policymakers and financial minds on the planet. Larry Summers, who as Treasury Secretary under Clinton championed the financial deregulation that contributed to the 2008 crisis. Peter Thiel, whose venture capital empire was built on the cheap capital environment that zero interest rates created. Bill Gates, the world's then richest man, whose foundation's endowment benefited enormously from asset price inflation. And here's the critical insight. Epstein wasn't just a passive participant in these conversations. He was a nexus point, a connector who brought together policymakers, billionaires, and financial operators in private settings where conversations about monetary policy, investment strategy, and political influence could happen without any public scrutiny. His homes in Manhattan, Palm Beach, Paris, and the U.S. Virgin Islands functioned as off-the-record salons where the direction of the global economy was discussed over dinner. This is the economic story that nobody is telling. The Epstein files don't just reveal a sex trafficking network, they reveal a shadow policy network, a parallel governance structure where unelected billionaires and former officials discussed monetary policy, interest rates, and economic strategy in private homes on private islands with zero transparency and zero accountability. And the man at the center of it, the man facilitating these conversations, was a convicted sex offender. Okay, we're now at the halfway point of this deep dive, and if you've made it this far, you're clearly someone who cares about understanding how the world really works. Before we go into the DOJ files and the political fallout, I need to ask you something. Are you subscribed? Because the second half of this video contains the most explosive material, the names, the cover-ups, the institutional failures. If this video gets enough engagement, I'll do a follow-up series going even deeper into individual banking relationships. So subscribe, hit the bell, and let's keep going. On November 18, 2025, the United States House of Representatives voted 427-1 to pass the Epstein Files Transparency Act. The lone dissenter was Republican Representative Clay Higgins of Louisiana. The next day, the Senate passed the bill by unanimous consent, and President Trump signed it into law. The law gave Attorney General Pam Bondi 30 days, until December 19, 2025, to release all unclassified DOJ records related to Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. The law was explicit in its demands. It required the release of flight logs, travel records, immunity deals, non-prosecution agreements, internal DOJ communications about decisions to charge or not charge, all documents relating to the destruction or concealment of evidence, and all documentation related to Epstein's detention and death. The law specifically stated that no record shall be withheld on the basis of embarrassment, reputational harm, or political sensitivity, including to any government official, public figure, or foreign dignitary. So what happened? On December 19th, the deadline, the DOJ released an initial batch of files, and the reaction was immediate. Bipartisan outrage over 500 pages were completely blacked out. The redactions were so extensive that entire documents were unreadable. Less than 1% of the total files had been released. And then something even more suspicious happened. Within 24 hours, 16 files that had been posted publicly disappeared from the DOJ website without explanation. But here's where it gets truly remarkable. The digital redactions were so poorly implemented that members of the public, regular citizens, were able to recover the blacked-out content by simply copying and pasting the text from the PDF files. The DOJ had used a cosmetic overlay rather than actual content removal. This meant that information officials had intended to withhold, including details about the trafficking ring's members and methods, was temporarily accessible to anyone who knew how to use a computer. In February 2025, months before the act was passed, Attorney General Bondi had told Fox News that the Epstein client list was sitting on my desk right now to review. This generated enormous public expectations. But on July 7th, Bondi's DOJ released a statement saying they had found no incriminating client list, directly contradicting her earlier statement. Conservative figures who had championed the file release were furious. Liz Wheeler, a prominent right-wing commentator who had been given access to early binders, marked Epstein Files Phase 1 at a White House event, called the situation unforgivable behavior. Then came January 30th, 2026. the DOJ released the massive final tranche, over 3 million pages, 180,000 images, and 2,000 videos. More than 500 attorneys and reviewers had been involved in the process. Deputy Attorney General Todd Blanche announced that the department had fulfilled its legal obligations, but Congressman Khanna, one of the co-authors of the Transparency Act, immediately pushed back, noting that the DOJ had identified over 6 million potentially responsive pages, but released only half. Approximately 200,000 pages were withheld or redacted based on various legal privileges. And here's the failure that drew the most criticism. The DOJ botched the redactions of victim names. At least 31 people who were victimized as children had their names exposed in the public release. Meanwhile, the names of alleged perpetrators were redacted, as Sky Roberts, the brother of Virginia Giuffre, one of Epstein's most vocal accusers who died by suicide in April 2025, put it. They're redacting the names of perpetrators and they're unredacting the names of victims. Quite the opposite of what the Epstein Files Transparency Act was meant to do. From an economics perspective, this institutional behavior has a name: regulatory capture. It's what happens when the agencies designed to protect the public instead protect the interests of the powerful. The DOJ was supposed to provide transparency. Instead, it provided the appearance of transparency, releasing a mountain of documents while ensuring that the most damaging connections remained obscure. This is exactly how financial regulators operated before the 2008 crisis. Lots of activity, lots of paperwork, and zero accountability. Now we come to the most uncomfortable part of this analysis. Because the DOJ files, combined with the Bloomberg emails and House Oversight Committee disclosures, paint a devastating picture of how the financial and political elite maintained relationships with Epstein after his 2008 conviction. Not before, when they could claim ignorance. After, when he was a registered sex offender whose crimes were public knowledge. Let's go through the evidence, name by name, following the financial and communication trails revealed in the documents. I want to be extremely clear. Appearing in these files does not mean someone committed a crime. Many of these individuals have denied any wrongdoing, but the pattern of continued engagement, the economic relationships that persisted despite public knowledge of Epstein's crimes, tells us something profound about how the ultra-wealthy operate in a moral vacuum. Howard Lutnick, now the United States Secretary of Commerce. Lutnick, the former CEO of Cantor Fitzgerald, told the New York Post in October 2025 that he cut ties with Epstein in 2005 after being creeped out during a tour of his Manhattan mansion. But the DOJ files tell a different story. Emails show Lutnick and Epstein corresponding through intermediaries in 2011 and 2012. In December 2012, Lutnick emailed Epstein directly, asking for coordinates for his boat captain to visit Epstein's private island. His wife, Allison, coordinated the trip with Epstein's assistant. They brought their 4 children. But it goes further. Documents show Lutnick and Epstein signed a business contract together in 2012 for a company called Adfin. In 2015, Lutnick invited Epstein to a Democratic fundraiser for Hillary Clinton. The Commerce Department's response: Lutnick had limited interactions with Epstein. Elon Musk, the world's richest man and former head of the Department of Government Efficiency, Musk had publicly claimed he refused to attend a party on Epstein's island. But the DOJ files include a 2014 email in which Musk wrote to Epstein asking for parties, saying he wanted to let loose and that a peaceful island experience is the opposite of what I'm looking for. In December 2013, Musk wrote asking if he could visit Epstein's island over the holidays. After the files were released, Musk posted that he had never been to any Epstein parties ever. The emails suggest at minimum that he was trying to attend one. Larry Summers, former U.S. Treasury Secretary and former president of Harvard University. The files show Summers and Epstein exchanging gossipy emails about Donald Trump during his first presidential term. In May 2017, Summers asked Epstein, "How guilty is Donald?" In October 2016, Summers asked Epstein how plausible it was that Trump was a real cocaine user. These emails reveal the casual intimacy between a former Treasury Secretary and a convicted sex offender, the kind of relationship that simply should not exist in any functioning system of elite accountability. Richard Branson, the Virgin Group founder. In a 2013 email, Branson told Epstein he'd be happy to meet any time as long as Epstein brought his harem. Branson also counseled Epstein to get Bill Gates to vouch for him after his sex offender registration. This is a billionaire coaching a convicted sex offender on reputation management. Bill Gates, the Microsoft co-founder and world's then richest man. Previous reporting had established that Gates met with Epstein numerous times, beginning in 2011. Epstein made claims about Gates in the newly released emails, which a Gates spokesperson called absurd and completely false. Gates acknowledged in a February 2026 interview that he had a number of dinners with Epstein and expressed regret for every minute spent with him. His ex-wife, Melinda French Gates, told NPR she felt unbelievable sadness seeing his name in the files. Peter Mandelson, the former British ambassador to the United States and influential labor politician, the DOJ files show that Mandelson had a deeply enmeshed relationship with Epstein. Bank transfers indicate approximately $75,000 was wired to Mandelson. More alarmingly, emails appear to show Mandelson sharing sensitive UK government information with Epstein, including an internal economics briefing about government assets that could be sold, forwarded to Epstein with the note. Interesting note that's gone to the PM. In 2010, Mandelson notified Epstein in advance that Prime Minister Gordon Brown was going to resign. London's Metropolitan Police have since launched an investigation into Mandelson for misconduct in public office. And then there's Coinbase. Yes, the cryptocurrency exchange. According to newly released files, Epstein invested $3 million in Coinbase in 2014 after his conviction, and the company accepted his money. As Coinbase grew into one of the largest crypto platforms in the world, Epstein's investment multiplied dramatically. Fred Ursam, the company's co-founder, wrote that it would be nice to meet Epstein. This raises fundamental questions about due diligence in the technology sector. Every single one of these relationships has the same underlying structure. A powerful person maintained access to Epstein because he provided something they valued: financial intelligence, social connections, investment opportunities, or simply the thrill of proximity to someone who operated completely outside normal rules. And in every case, the financial benefits of the relationship outweighed the moral cost of association with a convicted sex offender. That is the economic calculus that defines how the ultra-wealthy operate. Cost-benefit analysis applied to human trafficking. We're entering the final stretch. The last 30 minutes contain what I think is the most important part of this entire video: the systemic analysis. What does Epstein teach us about our financial system? What needs to change? And why should you, as someone who cares about economics, be paying attention to this? But before that, share this video with one person. Text it, post it. This story needs to reach beyond the usual audience. Economics is not just about GDP numbers and interest rates. It's about power. And this is the most important power story of our generation. The Epstein case exposes what I believe is the single biggest lie in modern finance. that the financial system has robust safeguards against criminal abuse. It doesn't, and the numbers prove it. The global anti-money laundering compliance industry is estimated to cost financial institutions over $200 billion per year. Banks employ tens of thousands of compliance officers. They file millions of suspicious activity reports with regulators every year. The regulatory framework includes the Bank Secrecy Act, the USA Patriot Act, FinCEN regulations, the EU's anti-money laundering directives, and dozens of other laws and regulations. And yet, the convicted sex offender maintained active accounts at over 20 banks, processed billions of dollars in transactions, and operated a network of shell companies across multiple jurisdictions for decades. JPMorgan's compliance systems flagged his activity, and the flags were overridden. Deutsche Bank onboarded him as a client 5 years after his conviction. Bear Stearns was dealing with him while he was under federal investigation. The reason is simple. Compliance is designed to catch small fish, not big ones. If you try to deposit $10,000 in cash at your local bank, a currency transaction report is automatically filed. If you wire $5,000 to a family member overseas, your bank's anti-money laundering system flags it. But if you're a billionaire moving $57 million into a hedge fund through a Bermuda-registered shell company, the system treats you as a valued client. The entire compliance apparatus is built on a paradox. The people who move the most money receive the least scrutiny. Consider these numbers. In the decade between 2012 and 2022, major global banks paid over $50 billion in fines for anti-money laundering failures, sanctions violations, and related compliance breakdowns. JPMorgan alone has paid billions. Deutsche Bank has paid billions. HSBC paid $1.9 billion for laundering money for Mexican drug cartels. And yet, in not a single case was a senior executive at a major bank criminally prosecuted for facilitating illicit financial flows. The cost of compliance failure is treated as a business expense, a cost of doing business, not as a criminal liability. The Epstein case is the ultimate proof that this system is fundamentally broken. Here was a case where the criminal activity was publicly known. The client was a registered sex offender. The suspicious transactions were flagged internally. And still, the banks continued to serve him because the fee income justified the risk. Because the compliance officers who flagged concerns were overruled by relationship managers who controlled the client revenue. Because the incentive structure within every major bank rewards revenue generation over risk management. And here's the broader economic implication. If the compliance system can't catch a publicly known criminal, it certainly can't catch sophisticated financial criminals who haven't been convicted yet. The United Nations estimates that between $800 billion and $2 trillion is laundered through the global financial system every year. That represents 2 to 5% of global GDP, and the vast majority of it passes through the same major banks that served Epstein. The DOJ files and the Paradise Papers, the massive leak from offshore services provider Appleby, reveal that Epstein was deeply embedded in the global offshore financial system. And this is where the individual story becomes an economic story of global significance. Epstein chaired a company called Liquid Funding Limited, registered in Bermuda, partially owned by Bear Stearns. This entity was loaded with mortgage-backed securities and collateralized loan obligations, the same toxic financial products that would destroy the global economy in 2008. Epstein's offshore vehicle was managed by directors who never met him, never held a board meeting, and whose involvement was purely pro forma. One director, Marcus Klug, told reporters, "There was neither a physical board meeting or a call between board members. I never met him. This is how the offshore system works. You register a company in a jurisdiction with minimal disclosure requirements. Bermuda, the British Virgin Islands, the Cayman Islands, Delaware. You appoint nominee directors who have no real oversight function. You use this entity to hold assets, conduct transactions, and shield your activities from public scrutiny. It's perfectly legal. It's also the same infrastructure used for tax evasion, money laundering, sanction circumvention, and, as Epstein demonstrated, the financial machinery of criminal enterprises. The scale of the offshore financial system is almost incomprehensible. Estimates suggest that between $21 trillion and $36 trillion in private wealth is held in offshore jurisdictions. That's roughly equivalent to the combined GDP of the United States and Japan. This money generates minimal tax revenue, escapes regulatory oversight, and exists in a parallel financial universe that operates by different rules than the one the rest of us live in. Epstein was a master of this system. In addition to liquid funding, he operated through a web of trusts, LLCs, and corporate entities registered in the U.S. Virgin Islands, New Mexico, New York, Florida, and overseas jurisdictions. His financial trust company controlled votes in Bear Stearns funds. His Southern Trust Company, the same entity that signed the Adfin contract with Howard Lutnick, was another piece of the puzzle. Each entity served a specific function: holding property, managing investments, shielding assets from legal claims, or obscuring the flow of funds. And here's the economic tragedy. The victims of Epstein's crimes, over 1,000 underage girls and young women, received approximately $120 from a compensation fund after his death. His estate, at the time of his death, was valued at close to $600 million. The math is grotesque. The victims received about 20 cents for every dollar of wealth Epstein accumulated through the system that enabled their abuse. The offshore financial system didn't just enable Epstein. It enabled the entire ecosystem of power and impunity that allowed his crimes to continue for decades. And that system is still operating today. The same banks, the same jurisdictions, the same legal structures, the same incentives. Nothing has fundamentally changed. The only difference is that now, thanks to 3.5 million pages of DOJ files, we can see exactly how it works. On August 10, 2019, Jeffrey Epstein was found dead in his cell at the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Manhattan. He was 66 years old. The official ruling was suicide by hanging, but the circumstances of his death have fueled endless speculation. And the DOJ files add new layers of complexity. We're not going to engage in conspiracy theories here. What we are going to do is follow the money. Because from an economic perspective, Epstein's death had massive financial consequences, and the DOJ files reveal details about his estate planning that are alarming. 2 days before his death, Epstein signed a new will, moving his assets, valued at approximately $577 million, into a trust called the 1953 Trust, named after his birth year. This trust was structured to make it significantly harder for his victims to access his wealth through civil litigation. The timing is extraordinary. A man supposedly on suicide watch in a maximum security federal facility had the foresight and legal access to restructure his entire estate 48 hours before his death. The composition of his assets at the time of death tells its own story. Approximately $56 million in cash, $195 million in hedge fund and private equity investments, $112 million in equities, $14 million in fixed income, and roughly $180 million in real estate, including the $77 million Manhattan townhouse, the $12 million Palm Beach mansion, the $17 million New Mexico ranch, an $8.6 million Paris apartment, and 2 private islands in the U.S. Virgin Islands purchased for a combined $28 million. After his death, a victims' compensation fund was established. More than 100 women came forward and received a total of approximately $121 million. By February 2021, the estate's value had dropped from an estimated $630 million to about $240 million, consumed by legal fees, settlements, and asset depreciation. The DOJ files also include emails between investigators discussing Epstein's death and his final note. The internal communication states that the note does not appear to be a suicide note, and a recent Wired investigation found that nearly 3 minutes were cut from the FBI's prison surveillance video of the area near Epstein's cell on the night of his death. 3 minutes in a facility that was supposed to have continuous surveillance of one of the most high-profile inmates in America. The economic lesson here isn't about how Epstein died. It's about what happened to his money. His victims received a fraction of his wealth. His legal and financial advisors, the people who helped him build and protect his fortune, continued to operate with zero consequences. And the financial system that enabled his wealth accumulation received no structural reform. In economics, we call this a moral hazard. When the costs of wrongdoing are borne by victims rather than perpetrators, the system has no incentive to change. The Epstein files are not just an American story. The fallout from the January 2026 release has reverberated across multiple countries, forcing resignations, launching investigations, and exposing the global reach of Epstein's network. In the United Kingdom, the files have triggered the most significant political scandal in years. Peter Mandelson was fired from his role as British ambassador to the United States in 2000 over his Epstein ties. But the January 2026 files revealed a far deeper relationship. Bank transfers show approximately $75,000 wired from Epstein to Mandelson. Emails show Mandelson sharing what appears to be sensitive UK government information, including advance notice of Prime Minister Gordon Brown's resignation. London's Metropolitan Police have launched a formal investigation into Mandelson for misconduct in public office. The files have also further implicated Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, formerly known as Prince Andrew. The January 2026 release included new photographs and communications showing the depth of continued contact after Epstein's 2008 conviction. Sarah Ferguson, Andrew's ex-wife, was shown emailing Epstein almost immediately after his release from jail, seeking advice. In Slovakia, the files led to the resignation of Miroslav Lajčák, the country's national security advisor and a former president of the UN General Assembly. In Turkey, prosecutors began reviewing the files as part of an investigation into allegations that Epstein trafficked Turkish children. In Israel, the files reinforced existing connections between Epstein and former Prime Minister Ehud Barak. The global pattern is unmistakable. Epstein's network was not confined to the United States. It spanned multiple continents, penetrated multiple governments, and involved individuals at the highest levels of political power. And in every case, the mechanism was the same: money and access. Epstein provided financial advice, investment opportunities, social connections, and entree to a world of extreme wealth. And in return, he received proximity to political power that shielded him from accountability. The economics principle at work here is called rent-seeking, using wealth to manipulate the political system to protect your position rather than to create value. Epstein was the ultimate rent-seeker. He didn't create products, build companies, or generate employment. He created influence. And that influence was his product, sold to the highest bidder in every country where he operated. Let me share some numbers that tell a remarkable story about the gap between public demand for accountability and institutional willingness to provide it. A December 2025 Economist and YouGov poll of 1,591 Americans found that 55% disapproved of Trump's handling of the Epstein investigation, while only 26% approved. More strikingly, 91% of Democrats, 78% of independents, and 74% of Republicans supported releasing the Epstein files. In an era of extreme political polarization, this may be the most bipartisan issue in America. A January 2026 CNN poll of 1,209 adults found that only 6% said they were satisfied with what the federal government had released. Nearly half of Republicans, 3/4 of independents, and 9 in 10 Democrats said the government was withholding information. These numbers are extraordinary. Across every demographic, across every political affiliation, the American public believes the government is not telling them the truth about Epstein. And they're probably right. The DOJ identified over 6 million potentially responsive pages and released only about half. Members of Congress who want to see the unredacted files must schedule 24-hour advance appointments to view them in a DOJ reading room, without electronic devices, without staff, and without the ability to take copies. The economics of transparency are simple. When institutions hoard information, they maintain power. When information flows freely, power shifts to the public. The fight over the Epstein files is, at its core, an economics fight. A fight over who controls the information that determines accountability, policy, and justice. And right now, by every measure, the institutions are winning. So where do we go from here? The Epstein files have been released. The names are out, the financial connections are documented, but what actually changes? If history is any guide, nothing. The 2008 financial crisis exposed massive fraud, regulatory failure, and systemic corruption. And the result was 0 criminal prosecutions of major bank executives, modest regulatory reforms that were subsequently rolled back, and a monetary policy response, 0 interest rates, and quantitative easing that made the wealthy even wealthier. The system didn't break. It adapted. But that doesn't mean we should accept this outcome. So let me lay out what I believe the Epstein case teaches us needs to change from an economic policy perspective. First, beneficial ownership transparency. Every country should require public registries of beneficial ownership for all corporate entities, with criminal penalties for non-compliance. If this had been in place in the 90s, Epstein's web of shell companies would have been far harder to maintain. Second, personal criminal liability for compliance failures. As long as anti-money laundering failures are punished with corporate fines rather than individual prosecution, nothing will change. JPMorgan paid $290 million. Deutsche Bank paid $150 million. These are rounding errors for institutions with hundreds of billions in revenue. Until compliance failures carry personal prison time for the decision makers involved, the incentive structure will continue to reward looking the other way. Third, offshore financial reform. The offshore system needs to be brought into the light. This means automatic exchange of financial information between all jurisdictions. It means eliminating nominee directors and requiring real governance of offshore entities. And it means holding the professional enablers, the lawyers, accountants, and formation agents who set up these structures, criminally liable when their structures are used for illegal purposes. Fourth, Reform of the private banking model. Private banking clients should be subject to enhanced due diligence, not reduced due diligence. And compliance functions in private banking divisions should report directly to regulators, not to the business leaders who profit from client relationships. Fifth, protection for whistleblowers and investigators. The Epstein case is littered with examples of people who tried to raise concerns and were ignored, silenced, or punished. A functioning system requires robust protection for the people who try to expose wrongdoing, not just after the fact, but in real time. We've spent the last 2 hours following the money, from a modest apartment in Brooklyn to Bear Stearns' trading floor, from a billionaire's mansion to a Bermuda shell company, from JPMorgan's private banking division to a private island in the Caribbean, from an attorney general's desk to 3.5 million pages of documents that still haven't told us the full truth. And after all of this research, after reading hundreds of pages of DOJ files, congressional reports, investigative journalism, and email transcripts, I keep coming back to one question. It's not who was on the island. It's not did Epstein kill himself. Those are important questions, but they're not economics questions. The economics question is this: what kind of financial system allows a college dropout with no real credentials to accumulate $600 million, maintain relationships with over 20 banks despite a criminal conviction, correspond privately with Treasury secretaries about monetary policy, invest in startup companies that later go public, and operate a global trafficking network for decades without a single financial institution saying no? The answer is our financial system, the one we all participate in every day, the one that holds our savings, processes our paychecks, and determines the cost of our mortgages, the same system that demands 3 forms of ID from you to open a checking account allowed Jeffrey Epstein to process billions of dollars through shell companies in secrecy. That is not a conspiracy, it's a design feature. And until we demand that it change, until we hold financial institutions and their leaders personally accountable for the consequences of their complicity, the next Epstein is already out there, moving money through the same system, protected by the same structures, enabled by the same silence. The files are released, the money trail is documented. The question is, what are we going to do about it? If this video opened your eyes to something you didn't know before, please subscribe to this channel. I don't say this for the algorithm. I say this because economics content that goes this deep, this long, and this sourced doesn't get made unless there's an audience that demands it. Every subscriber tells me to keep going. Every share puts this in front of someone who needs to see it. And every comment adds to the conversation that the mainstream media is afraid to have. I'll see you in the next one.